So after Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, there is, of course, in the canon, the arrangement of the texts. There's the second letter to the Corinthians. This letter is not quite the way we found the first one. The first one has, while it's an ad hoc letter, that is the letter that kind of spins out the issues, Second Corinthians presents us with a number of challenges. And the challenges all center on how you read the text. The text is not exactly clear. There are some, looks like some major fractures in terms of the content. And it's led scholars to a number of beliefs about this letter. So let's look into it a little bit more. This is a map of Corinth. You can see it's right there on the northwest side of this little strait. You'll see it right here. So Corinth is right here. This is where we're talking about. This is Paul's second missionary journey, where maybe it's the third. This is Voyage to Rome. But in any case, you can get a picture of where Paul is. He's right here in this little area, and it's a fantastic area to be because it provides the open sea route around the Peloponnese, and yet it connects to, basically the majority of Europe. If you look up here, this is this area right here, Macedonia, goes right into modern day Macedonia, Croatia, Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Romania. So that's all right in that spot. Here's Turkey, right? Asia Minor. This area right here, Galatia, it's a giant area that was so called. So this gives you an idea where we are. Of course, from the first letter, you got a little more of the context, but we remember that Corinth was the place before its destruction, and then it picked up the influence again, but before its destruction, it was the location of the Isthmian Games, and the Isthmian Games was second only to the Olympian Games. They called these games Pan-Hellenic. That is, they went all over the Greek world, and people came all over to compete. Notice this is a rendering of this coin. And numismatics, the study of coins, helps us quite a bit because it provides some anchor points historically and as well as with content. In fact, when you study ancient coinage, because there was no really no centralized mint, you can get a sense of local attributes based on looking at the coins and what was put on the coins. So if you look at 2 Corinthians and you compare it to 1 Corinthians, you get the decided idea that this 2 Corinthians definitely seems like we have a composite letter. So what does a composite letter mean? It's several letters that are put together, and this is, of course, this leads to the next question: how many? How many different letters were there? Scholars differ in their approach too. Most people acknowledge that there's just not one, but are there 2, 3, 4 different letters here? Most are content with 2. Although there are 2 subsections that really give us pause. 2:14 through 6:10 and 8 and 9 seem to be independent units altogether. Some of these disjointed passages in 2 Corinthians will give you an idea of what kind of prompts scholars to unpack the notion that maybe you've got a couple different letters here. Let me show you this first one. Notice how in chapter 1, it is God who establishes us with you in Christ and has anointed us by putting his seal on us and giving us his Spirit in our hearts as a first installment. But I call on God as a witness against me, it was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. I did not mean to imply. And so he keeps going, right? He keeps going here. And he's talking about his love for them. And if anyone has caused pain to me, um, he's talking about this declension. Um, Scholars think, well, this looks pretty big. Like look how just the NRSV puts this gap, verse 22, by putting his seal on us and giving us his spirit in our hearts as a first installment. And then if you should go from that, in terms of the heart, look at how this one starts. Make room in your hearts for us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have taken advantage of no one. I do not say this to condemn you, for I said before that you are in our hearts, to die together, to live together. I often boast about you. I have great pride in you. I'm filled with confidence. For even when we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted in every way. Notice how chapter 1 and chapter 2 pick up right here in 7:2. And notice also that at 7:1, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and of spirit, making holiness perfect in the fear of God. Boy, does that sound like a great closing piece. So that's just one example where it may make sense to see that chapter 2 passage as leading right into chapter 7. And so could it be that this letter, somebody has copied it and then inserted this material? No one really disputes whether this material is from Paul or not. What they dispute is whether this was a letter composed all in one setting. And I mean, it's easy to suggest either way. For you and for me, putting something in text is really easy. We write a note on paper, and when we don't like the note, we throw the paper away and grab another one. The use of paper in the ancient world was not so easy. You had ostrakhan, obviously, the little pieces of pottery. Once a clay pot is shattered, you can't do anything with it. And so what they would do is they would take the fragments and use them for their lists and outlines and plans and all this kind of thing. Paper, on the other hand, was reserved for things that needed done by the technocrats of the age, the scribes. And it wasn't a cheap proposition. It was a rather expensive one to have a letter commissioned. You may recall at one point or another the idea of a letter book. A letter book was a book that you not only wrote your letter to a person, but you wrote their response as well. And so you would have the letter followed by response, letter, response. And so, but what you would do is you would be making 2 copies of your letter. One copy you'd be keeping for yourself in your letter book, and then the next one you'd send away. That's how precious text, paper, letters, they were all precious. It's very possible to conceive that there came into the possession of the Corinthian believers multiple copies of different letters, and someone tried to fit them together to make a better production. Look at chapter 2:14, for instance. But thanks be to God who always leads us in triumphal procession. And then the concluding text, which is chapter 6, verse 10. So sorrowful, yet always rejoicing as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There's no restriction on our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak to you as children. Open wide your hearts also. You see, this part right here, 11 and 12 could be taken to move into that next set of materials, but this large section, 2:14 through 6:10, has been characterized as its own letter. And then finally, I'll show you chapters 8 and 9. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. Doesn't that sound like a beginning of a letter? It has elements to it that imply the beginning of a letter. Now, obviously, it works pretty well here in chapter 8 too. And then chapter 9, it's not necessary for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. And so Paul's going to talk about the saints. And thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. So this part is really encouraging. 8 and 9 is really encouraging. Now look what happens in chapter 10. It's like, I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Notice how that goes. Paul is not exactly being meek and gentle here, even though he's humble when face to face, but bold toward you when I am away. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. I don't know if you can catch, but this is a real change in tone. Um, let's see. He talks about his confidence. I do not want to seem as though I'm trying to frighten you with my letters. Anyway, this content, we're stepping over our bounds. We boast beyond limits. It's brash, you know. And he continues, I wish you would bear with me. A little foolishness. Do bear with me. And he continues to go on. It really is a different sort of tone. For these reasons, most scholars will suggest that you're dealing with a number of different letters when you get to 1 Corinthians. Now, if you're looking for clues, Hans Windisch, his commentary, he was the one that noticed these disjointed pieces in the text. And he begins to talk about interpolations in these multiple letters. An interpolation is when a scribe at some point or another puts something else in. Now, for 2 Corinthians, most scholars are suggesting that what is put in is still Paul's. It's just not the same letter, which can be very difficult for us to try to discern. Nonetheless, Windisch is the one who began to talk about that. He also supposed that chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians was a sort of sermon that Paul took from somebody else. In other words, it wasn't Paul's main idea. Dieter Georgi came along in the 1960s, and he's searching here in the text. He's doing a mirror reading of the text. He's trying to discern who are the opponents that Paul is tackling. Who is it that wants a letter of recommendation in chapter 3? Why does Paul have to go through such great pains in chapters 10 through 13 in order to get the church more in line? Georgi supposes that what you have is you already have a precedent. The letters of recommendation that are requested in chapter 3 may be evidence of a group of folks who brought their letter of recommendation to the Corinthian church in order to get a better witness. And Paul has to say, you are my letter of recommendation, for you're written on the human heart. And so it may be that Jewish or Christian proselytizers, people who are advocating for their own distinct message, were coming along and trying to persuade the Corinthians to abandon their father in the church, that is Paul. Georgi further explained the disjointed nature of the text by an appeal to these kinds of proselytizers, missionaries, Jewish and or Christian missionaries. What's the problem? The problem is that the evidence is so uneven. And while almost everybody will admit the evidence into discussion, once you scrutinize it more closely, there are a lot of questions about it. So let me give you a couple pieces of evidence that have been used, and then I'll show you how that can be troublesome. So one piece of evidence for the presence of these Jewish or Jewish Christian proselytizers, missionaries who are going around and doing much the same thing as Paul is the evidence of basically population records that attribute large numbers of Jews in different communities and their actions as they try to make inroads into their broader